The final unique week of Mythic Plus testing has just concluded, and I have a lot of thoughts to give you guys. And we did now all the dungeons, all 8 dungeons. I've made 2 videos on this already, so if you guys haven't seen those, yeah, you kind of need to catch up on that. But we'll only talk about these 3 dungeons from this week, which was the 3 returning dungeons. That's Motherload, Theater of Pain, and Workshop. Now, I had already made a video on some of this topic, and it was going to be a video that was not one that I think people were going to like, so I didn't end up publishing it. But basically, there was a lot of weird commentary being made about proposed, or I guess data mined changes leading up to these dungeons coming back, especially Theater of Pain and Motherload. And I know that people are oftentimes just like chomping at the bit for WoW news, and that they let websites like Wowhead and other influencers kind of give you guys these overarching, like, broad stroked painted brushed things on dungeons that you're going to run hundreds of times, so everybody's just like waiting to overreact, right? But I looked at those articles and the comments and what actually was being said about them, and it really made me like lose hope in humanity, kind of thing. Like, there was dungeon changes that made the dungeon look theoretically harder, and people were like, I quit. You know what I mean? It's really weird how people just give up, and before they even try, how they don't try to even test stuff. And we had a lot of trouble with that on the PTR this week too, where people give up, things are hard, and they quit, and you just don't really get to do a lot of testing. So we did do each dungeon, like I kind of set time aside for each dungeon once, and then we move on. We finished every dungeon except Motherload. We did not finish Motherload once. So let's start with Motherload, because that is my favorite dungeon. Probably one of my top 5 all time, and it is certainly going to be the favorite of the season, provided the route stuff doesn't go in any weird direction again. It probably will, to be honest, because they didn't make any changes to the layout of the dungeon or the way the trash count might work. It seems identical, in fact. So I imagine people will still try to do the double death skip. The only difference is the actual death effects. So I don't have much to comment on the route, but I will say the old route I used gave pretty much exact count again. And we never really got to do the route because people keep like backpedaling into trash. The trash in this dungeon is insanely hard. It is, so there's 3 dungeons right now that were testable this week, and all 3 are quite different difficulties. So Motherload is the hardest of the 3. It's mostly due to the actual trash, to be honest. It's an outlier in that way. A lot of the dungeons seem to be hard because of the bosses this season, but the trash is, kind of an afterthought. It's the other way around. This time, you guys probably remember Motherload trash. It was very mechanically dense. Some of the Motherload trash has more mechanics than some of the bosses in, say, Operation Floodgate. So, big pulls look normal, but in reality, they may be very hard to pull off. And they did add some mechanics. Famously, they add like this like weird yellow ball that kind of rotates around. I think it's by the masterminds. I'm not exactly sure which mob type does it, because you always fight them together. But yeah, it might be the masterminds. I think that's probably it. And yeah, that whole area is just chaos, like utter chaos leading up to the first, second, and third boss. There's just tons and tons of trash that's really difficult. And then the final trash is the exact same, with the bombs nearly one-shotting me as a Death Knight. So without question, the hardest trash in terms of tuning I have done in all 8 of these dungeons is this dungeon, is Motherload. I would say mechanically it is very, very complicated, but if people get good at it again, it won't be as hard as perhaps, I think, a dungeon like what's the Dawnbreaker one? I can't remember the name off the top of my head. The church one, that dungeon is probably going to be harder for people to do well because of the way the trash works and the overlaps and the different mechanics that it has. But that dungeon mechanically is far easier. It's just potentially more pesky, if that makes any sense. Anyway, Motherload was not only difficult because of the trash, it was also extremely difficult because of the last boss. Now, the first 3 bosses actually were pretty much the exact same. I would say that they're quite different. Well, that's not true. The second boss is wildly different. But the first boss especially, I would say, is quite different because of the circles. It's far easier to see exactly where the danger is on that fight. And it's really, really cool for that reason. I do think they added extra bombs, like the kicks of the soccer ball bombs that you have to do. I think there was only 3. Faxi brought that up. I think there's 5 now, and there was only 3 in the past. I don't know that for sure. It's been a long time, so if anybody knows any of these changes, please comment them down below. But outside of that, nothing really changes on the boss. It's just a little bit maybe faster paced because the bombs, and I think you really do need to make sure everybody is getting one ASAP, especially if there is like kind of 5 and all people are going to have to contribute now. Then the second boss is basically redesigned, although it looks almost identical. It's visually identical, but it's basically a redesign. I think there was even more ads. Again, I don't remember all this stuff. But now there's basically just one ad that you have to kill. It empowers one of the two ads that are there, and that ad pulses AoE damage. And if it's alive when he stomps, you wipe. But the thing is, the ad gets healed to full every time he empowers it. So you basically can only attack the ad during this phase, and then you burn it, and everybody switches basically to single target it, and then you cleave off it, and it dies, and then you go back to the normal fight that we know from the previous time. The difference is there's a second ad, and it doesn't need to really be like cared about. It's effectively just running around chasing people. And the way it plays out is the second ad is always going to be the lowest health, and he always empowers the one with the most health, I guess, which is a fair, it's like kind of like a fair thing. Like, because if it was the lowest health empowered every time, then it would very likely empower one that was at maybe 1% health here and there, which heals it to full, by the way. So that's kind of weird, but it's good that they did that, but it's kind of weird that there's just always one ad up. And if you get meleeed by this ad, you take a stacking bleed, so you kind of just keep rooting it, but I don't really know. People are saying maybe just CC it, because you can actually use these like little bombs. There's like a little factory tractor looking thing. I don't really know what it is. It's definitely not why I just say that. Pow. Anyway, yeah, no, I don't know what you would use, how you would use them, because there's probably going to be too much AoE for it to work. But if you could CC one out, then that makes the fight a very different encounter. But that fight was just kind of hard because I think people didn't know that. And then the third fight, I think it's just easier. Like, it doesn't seem like anything's really changed. They got rid of the dot, seemingly, on the fight. And then the final boss is actually identical in terms of mechanical, like, structure. But it seems like everything goes way, 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 way faster. I don't remember the Gatling gun happening as quickly. But we did continue to find use of that old kind of, it's almost like an exploit. The way the mechanics work on that fight is they're supposed to be like patterns. It's almost like a firewall type mechanic that you're meant to vacate, right? And now if you do the normal strategy where you would think Blizzard has designed it this way, you would vacate from one quadrant of the room to another or whatever it is. And as you're moving him, he starts shooting the Gatling gun at you. So it was like impossible because they happen at the same time. So it felt like you almost had to do the old cheese strategy. Now, if you're not aware, there's like a single, maybe like 5-yard wide area on the fight that never has the bomb barrage thing on it. So even though like that 1/3 of the room is meant to be covered with fire, because they're like just kind of tossed out haphazardly, there's a small section that's clear every single time. You'll never get hit by a bomb there or whatever, the fire barrage thing. So you can actually stand there the whole time. But the problem is now the boss does the Gatling gun so often that it almost forces you to move at times out of it. Now, as the tank, you can choose where it's aimed, but it's going to spin. It's going to spin on top of you, and it may make that impossible. Like, you may not actually be able to stack there. I don't know. I don't really know how it's going to play out, but again, levers on the PTR made it impossible to actually make any progress. And I think we've seen the whole fight, but I'd imagine it's going to be a little different than you expect it to be, and it does seem like everything's happening way, 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 way more often, especially the Gatling gun. That's really the only mechanic that's like that, but it's so much like that it's really notable. So anyway, Motherload, definitely the hardest of the three. It's my favorite dungeon, and I hope that there won't be squirrely routes and bullshit where you're trying to like die twice to skip trash, but I bet there probably will be. Then we'll talk about theater. This was the one that was the most hotly contested because people saw a lot of changes in the dungeon, and everybody has this weird opinion of theater, like if it's one of the worst dungeons ever made. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and try to convince you that it's one of the worst dungeons ever made, but I will tell you it was by far the easiest of the three we tested today, or the last few days. And I don't really know why, to be honest. Everything in there felt like it died really quick, but I kind of feel like that happened in all the dungeons. It was just the mechanics were not dense enough that it caused you to lose uptime, maybe? I don't really know. I can't really pinpoint it, to be honest, because at times it did seem hard. But I agreed with the assessment that was made in the stream that it seemed like the hardest part of theater was the first pack and the first boss. And then everything else just got easier from there. They did make substantial changes to the dungeon pretty much throughout. The first boss is different in the way that you need to kind of make sure they all die at the same time. Every time you kill one, the next one basically can do its mechanics more often and does more damage. And then by the third one, like if you killed one, then two, and then the third one's the only one that's up, it starts spamming its mechanic. Like it does it every few seconds because the mechanic takes a long time to actually finish. It just basically goes from mechanic to mechanic. So it's probably going to be easy once people figure that out. Like you want to kind of keep them even. But I also think maybe killing the most dangerous one first is also still a good strategy. At this point, it seems like that's the guy who does the Mortal Strike. The fight is still hard to tank and probably the only outlier in the entire game right now, in the entire season that is, that's hard to tank. Mostly because the Mortal Strike is a Blood Death Knight, but I actually almost died to that fight multiple times, and it would definitely be a very hard solo save. But yeah, again, the visuals have changed a lot in the fight because of the swirl mechanics, and then the trash leading up to it is insanely dangerous now. I don't really think it's changed much, but it does look like it's changed because there's like this new red aura banner looking thing. I don't know what's going on with that. But then, yeah, I think the idea of combining them is probably totally out. You know, this is something people used to do, especially on certain weeks. I don't think I would ever want to do that because unless the timer is extremely tight, that seems like the hardest part of the whole dungeon. Then you're going to go downstairs. We're just going to go through the bosses in the order I used to do them in. So that would be the PvP boss, whatever you want to call that one. The trash leading up to it is still very hard. There's the gamification of it where you can, I think it's whichever one auto attacks last is the one that spawns when you cross the threshold. So you kind of wait, you stand right at the threshold and then cross it when you see the right one is going to spawn. There's definitely going to be still doing that because there's some that are just harder than others, like the two that you fight, they're not created equal. In terms of the situation with the trash in the area besides that, it's just like very small, normal mob types. But we used to mind control that one mob out. It was a very, very dangerous mob, and it was a good buff for everybody. So it was like a slam dunk to take that. But this was a long time ago, so I don't know, I don't know if people are still going to want to do that or how it worked. But we did see somebody try to mind control, and it still had the same old bugs where when you leave the areas, like especially when you port upstairs, the mob bugs out. And, if you saw this channel during Shadowlands, you know that it caused havoc. Like we actually had keys to spand over me mind controlling this mob because it would never come upstairs and we needed it for count, or it would come upstairs at the wrong time and reset the boss. Very strange stuff. That actually happened in Workshop for a different reason, but we're not going to get into that today. And then probably the most notable thing is the Lich boss. It's a total redesign, like not the same fight almost. It looks similar, but it's almost not the same. There's these orbs that you have to constantly move out, like they're kind of spirally, circly around the room, and you have to dodge them. And then instead of like the ghost shooting out of your body and running into like a trap or however it used to work, now it's just an ad that if it reaches the boss, you die and it has to be attacked. So even as the tank, you have one of these ads, and now you have to run all the way, as far away as possible. And I think the big thing is going to be pug difficulty of getting everybody together, because I did that fight probably like 7 or 8 times this week, and it was like the only way to kill that fight is everybody to stack up. If you have 5 ads all around the circle of the room, it's a very small room as well, you will never, like one player will not kill their ad on their own. Like, it's not going to happen. So that fight could be potentially very difficult, but I think on, any coordination level at all, it's probably going to be the easiest fight in there. And then Gorchop, we kind of skipped him, but he is just the exact same. It doesn't seem like anything changed in his area. You can still potentially walk past the patrolling guy. We used to joke about they have a frontal and a backle. It's kind of funny. But anyway, yeah, no, you can still do everything else there in the same. And that boss still, kind of hard to tank. The tank breakers don't exist. This is another thing that I'll comment on. Like, I don't like tanking as a Blood Death Knight. Again, we were 665. This time we only did 10s. So contrast that to the last video. You remember where I was saying people were saying 10s were just impossible and we were struggling on 5s? Now, there was different itemable scaling, so it's a hard thing to compare. But this week we only did 10s, and we actually upgraded Workshop. We actually upgraded a 10 Workshop. We finished Theater both times we did it without much ado. And then Motherload, the last boss, was just impossible for people. So, and then the lever situation made it worse. So, yeah, I think Theater is actually by far the easiest just in terms of tuning. Could that change? Yeah, of course. I don't know that any of the changes that people were freaking out about that I was talking about making a video on I don't know that they even matter. Like I'm not aware of anybody who would even notice them. Like I didn't notice them, and I'm looking for them. You know what I mean? It's hard to even remember what changes they were making. That's like the dungeon just doesn't really do that much. Now again, this is from a tank perspective, and like I said, tanking seems to be insanely easy this season, at least on Blood Death Night. So we'll see. We'll see what actually happens. Again, it's only a 10 on the PTR, but I think maybe a lot of that was overblown. And then anyway, workshop final dungeon to talk about here today. This dungeon has substantial changes, significant overhaul of the first area. Instead of just one pack, there's 4 packs. I guess you can call that an overhaul. But I think if you guys remember, this is to combat the ability to solo the trash. I wanted to test it, but I never actually did. But yeah, in the previous versions of this dungeon, the bombs that get thrown out, it's kind of like a barrage of fire, just like in Motherload. It does damage to both the trash and to the players. So what you can do with one player, you can have all the bombs directly in one spot. So all the mobs are together, the tank's standing there, and you just drag them through the fire and they die. You kill them on your own. It's faster to solo it than it is to do it with a group because the bombs do that much damage and every single one hits the trash. Now, I didn't try that, but the fact that there's 4 packs probably means that's not going to be the fastest way to do that area anymore. And also the interesting thing about all these trash changes, no effective trash count changes at all in Workshop. It's the exact same. You pretty much can't skip anything other than the last pack, or you can do an invis pot in the middle area, which was also substantially changed. I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, the first boss is now a totally different encounter as well. Kind of. It's got pretty much all the same. I mean, it has some extra mechanics, like they're throwing bombs out, and there's a little bit more frequency of some of the stuff that's happening. But the big change is that the main focus of the fight is not just killing one while the tank fiddles with the other one. That's how it used to be. The tall robot needed to be broken, and while the tank did that, the rest of the group would handle the tank, like the kind of the wide robot. Now they both need to be tanked. They both probably need to be kept together. And the big change is that there's no armor debuffs on the tall robot by default. It's actually a mechanic now. Like he puts it on, and then you need to go break it at that point. But it's only a 30% damage reduction, and it's only a 30% buff when you break it. So it's kind of like, I mean, obviously you're not going to ignore it, but it doesn't feel like it's a huge part of the fight anymore like it used to be. Like it was a centerpiece of the fight in the past, So that fight's wildly different. Then we go downstairs. It's just something to note. I have the gem in my ring that makes me a little bit taller, and it's like really hard for my Night Elf to fit in the doorways. So I'd imagine if you also use that, I don't even remember what gem that is. I think that's the stamina one that probably nobody uses. But anyway, if you use it and you're a Tauren, I imagine you definitely aren't going to fit. Like you may have a key bricked over I don't know if you can take the gems out in the middle of the dungeon. I don't know what would happen, but I barely fit in those little corridors. But anyway, they did change the trash down there a lot. The big thing is the robot driller guys are now like one of the hardest mobs in the game. They do an insane amount of AoE damage, and instead of a normal like the tank frontal thing that you would dodge and have to not aim at other players, it actually is just a bleed on you now. Like it's not the same mechanic basically. And that bleed seemed pretty dangerous. People were saying that they watched other tanks doing on higher keys even, and they were getting slaughtered by it. But then the interesting part about that area is those small blobs that used to explode, they don't explode anymore. They don't seem to do anything, actually. I'm not sure why they're even still there. I guess they auto-attack, and that's it. I could have missed something, but yeah, they don't seem to do that, and I think that's probably intended. I think they did not want people cheesing, because what you used to do there was you can line of sight it. So what people would do is they'd pull the whole room, burn them down, and then everybody would go line of sight it, and the tank would finish them, and you would just annihilate that whole count without any actual danger. So I think they're probably trying to avoid that, But then in the dog room, like the robot dog room, there's actually new robot trash mobs, pretty much identical to the boss. There's, I think, 10 of them, and they do a stacking bleed every time they jump on somebody. So you kind of can't, it's like a magic debuff, so it can be dispelled. But yeah, you kind of can't pull. I did 5 and 5, and that seemed pretty squirrely. The thing is, the jump has a cast, so you can, obviously, you probably do something like Ursul's as well. But yeah, I think you want to just try to stun them and rotate that. Not let any one player get more than one jump. Like if you have 5 people and 5 people all get 1 jump, it's probably survivable. But if you have 1 person get 3 jumps, they're probably dead unless you get a snap to spell. And then the boss is pretty much the exact same. The circles, like the new visual indication of the circles. If you guys haven't seen that, by the way, you need to go look at the stream. It's crazy how different the game looks with those. But that fight also has that. And then it seems like the leap, you know how the leap used to break the boxes? We had somebody who I thought should have broken the box with their failure of the leap, and it didn't break it. So I don't know if that's confirmed changed. And then pretty much the rest of the dungeon's the exact same. I think it is actually the exact same. The third boss is insanely difficult, and it always is going to be. I do feel like the mechanics are also faster, but again, I can't really confirm that. And then the only other change in the dungeon is, you know, there used to be like that gambit of 3 mobs, and the third mob you can drag. It was like a kind of another one of those crawler-looking robots. You can drag it all the way to the side, and it would do this kind of like Simon Says pattern, or I don't know how you even describe it, but it's like you have to figure out where you have to go and quickly get there, and then you're dancing around the 4 different quadrants, almost like a safety dance type thing. You were able to just totally ignore that as a ranged or healer. You can pull it to the corner, and the width of the mechanic was not wide enough that you couldn't attack from the end of it. So Blizzard made that mob not movable anymore, which is a funny way to solve that problem. But in so doing, they also made the mechanic look insanely cool. Like, I'm talking about the coolest looking mechanic in any Mythic Plus I've ever seen. It like darkens the room, and the edges are like super electrical and defined, and people still die to it on the PTR, which is funny. But yeah, it's the coolest looking mechanic in any dungeon this season for sure. And I think just in general, like the definition of the mechanics is going to be crazy. Like if you still have not seen any minute of PTR that I've done, it's wild. It's like a whole different game. It really is. It doesn't even look like the same game. And mechanics like that coin vacuum on the first boss in Motherload used to be like, oh, I can't believe I was that close. Like, really? How did he get a coin there? Like, there's no question about it now. So it really makes a lot of fights a lot easier. And I think everybody who's worried about difficulty, like, reality is it's probably going to be easier for a lot of people, because I think people who are not mechanically gifted, you know what I mean? Like, they're not great at these things. It's going to be a lot easier to know if you're bad or not, you know, like, okay, well, now the edge is super defined. So you'd be like, oh, I was out of that. Like, that's gone. You know what I mean? But yeah, these 3 dungeons did seem a lot easier. I mean, just the fact that we did them on 10 with no issues, where, again, I didn't get to test it because of the bad kind of service provided by Blizzard in the previous week. We didn't have a lot of time, and there was 4 dungeons. People said, don't even bother with 10s. They're insane. So just based on that, this is very, very poor descriptions here, but this is just what I have. It does seem like the 4 War Within dungeons are going to be the hardest. Now, you know, who knows? Who knows if that's true or not, but yeah, we'll see what happens. And I think, you know, if you're to ask me to compare Season 1 and Season 2, which a lot of people have been trying to do, all I can say is I enjoyed Season 1. I enjoyed it being harder. I want it to be harder. Okay, if you don't know me, if you're hearing me speak about this for the first time, you know, unfortunately, we may not agree on this. I do not want the game to be made easier just because it's hard. Like, if you are struggling to succeed, there's a pretty clear way to improve, right? Like, for the most part, almost every mistake that's made in this game is something that you personally can improve upon. And I would rather see players do that than Blizzard just nerf the game. It's a little bit of a, you know, weird thing to talk about in Mythic Plus, considering Mythic Plus is scalable content, but I do think, especially now with that 2850 achievement, they are probably going to end up making dungeons easier. I think that was their goal. It's probably to get everybody who actually cares about Mythic Plus to 12 ASAP, and then from then on, progression starts. It's almost like there's 2 levels. There's pushers and there's farmers. So if you're not in 12, then you're just not a pusher, I think is probably what they're going for. But anyway, that's pretty much all I got, and yeah, that's probably going to be the last video on the PTR dungeons. So if anybody has any questions, leave them here. Maybe there'll be another one if something changes, like some big changes, but I do think that Season 2 is going to be great, and I'm excited for it. So thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.